This is the Teach Me Fashion skater skirt. Once you have cut out the size you need, notch all the markings onto the fabric using scissors with a sharp point. Remove the pattern pieces. There is only one seam at the centre back of this skirt. I have cut a contrast facing for a highlight, but you can use the same fabric as your skirt, or if you think that it is a bit thick, you could do what I have done here, or use a lining. With right sides together and matching the notches, pin the skirt and the waist panel together. Stitch on the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance carefully as you are sewing a curved seam. Just let the fabric feed through the machine. Don't pull on it or you will stretch the seam. This seam will be pressed open later. Now to the sewing of the invisible zip. If you have an invisible zipper foot, use that, but an ordinary zipper foot can work just as well. Undo the zip and pin it face down onto your seam allowance. Roll the teeth of the zip open and resting your zipper foot up against the zip, stitch this into position. Close the zip and place a pin on the tape opposite the seam of the waist panel. This will give you a guide to follow when you undo the zip. Now undo the zip, roll back the right side of the zip so it's face down onto the other seam allowance. Match the pin with the seam allowance of the waist panel. Stitch into position as far as the zip will allow you to go. Zip the zip up to check everything matches. To finish off the zip, with right sides together, pin the bottom of the zip through from one side to the other. Now using your zipper foot again, place it up against the end of the zip and stitch the centre back seam. Make sure you reinforce the beginning and the end of your stitching line. Neaten this seam by zigzagging or overlocking. Now let's go to the hem and double neaten it. Firstly, fold up about 0.5 centimetres or 1/4 of an inch and stitch close to the edge of the hem. Trim this seam back to the stitching line. Now fold the hem up for another 1 centimetre or about 1/2 an inch and stitch on the outer edge of this fold to complete the hem. This will give you a very neat hemmed edge. Using fusing tape, you can see I am measuring the tape from the paper pattern. The reason for this is that the paper doesn't stretch, but your fabric pattern piece may have stretched, so this is much more accurate. Cut this to fit the pattern, making sure you have it on the stitching line, not the outside edge of the pattern. If you can't find tape that fuses, you can just use ordinary tape, or you can even use the selvage edge of the fabric. Now using the centre front and any other notches you have, pin the facing to the waist of the skirt. Stitch through the tape. If you don't stitch through the tape, it will not stop your waist from stretching. Check like I have here to make sure your seams match at the zipper. Now go back to the machine and flat stitch the facing by opening out the seam at the waist, making sure the seam allowance is under the facing, and stitch very close to the seamed edge. You may need to trim some of your seam allowance away first. It just depends how easily manipulated your fabric is. This can help reduce the bulk caused by excessive seam allowance. Neaten by zigzagging or overlocking the outer edge of your facing. Now fold back the facing and stitch using your zipper foot. You don't need to sew super close, just enough to catch the tape of the zipper. Pin the facing onto the front seam and trim off excess threads for a clean finish. Now go back to the machine to stitch the facing to the seam allowance of the waist yoke. Give your skirt a press. Well done, you're finished.